Okay, well, I'm Bobby Tanner. Here we're going to talk about the 20 Mule Team. The talk, I see the talk is listed as how to drive a 20 Mule Team. So we'll get into that, about all the little ins and outs, the technical things that make a 20 Mule Team work, how the steering works, how the wagons work, all of that. But first we'll talk a little bit about the history, what the 20 Mule Team is. These long line teams, they were, one time they were the backbone of America as far as moving large quantities of products. They were the 18-wheelers of the day. And so they started, these types of hitches started on the East Coast, the Eastern Seaboard in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And back there they were called bell teams because that was when they started using bells. But they were 6 and 8 horse draft horse teams. Horses did okay in that climate. There's lots of water. But they weren't very big teams because the topography. The topography is what makes these teams work. The wide open spaces. Back there is rolling hills, muddy roads, forested, windy roads. And then also the technology wasn't there to put a lot of weight on the wagons. And with the western expansion, once settlement, development got out past the Mississippi River and got out into bigger, vast open spaces, then these bigger teams, they worked to have bigger teams. And also in the mid-1800s, another invention came along that allowed much heavier loads on the wagons. Was they started putting iron axles in the wagons. Prior to that, they would cut a tree and have a wooden beam, and that was the axle for the wagons. There was only so much weight they could put on the wagons at that time. And then by the mid-1800s, when the western movement had gotten out to these big, wide open spaces, they also had the iron axle wagons. So then these teams just kind of took off at that point. And these teams were all over the place. They were in Wyoming. They were called sheep trains up there. So one time wool was a very, very highly regarded commodity. And I've seen pictures of 16, 18, 20 mules pulling a half dozen wagons with just a huge pile of wool on top of the wagon. So the wool trains were a big thing. Mining all over the West, up in Idaho, down in Arizona, that kind of stuff. Here locally, up in the town of Bodie, everything was moved by these big teams. Down here at the Owens Lake, just south of here, silver bullion went from there to Los Angeles with these big teams. And then another thing that started being moved by these big teams was the borax. And so just on the other side of these mountains here, just right over there, was quite a few borax deposits. And that was the start of the Borax Company in the 1870s. So 150 years ago, this year is the 150th anniversary of the Borax Company. And so that was where they started hauling with the 20 Mule Teams. So in the 1870s, just on the other side of that mountain, they had trips north to Wadsworth, Nevada, and they would seem like they're out in the middle of nowhere, but they put the borax on the mule teams there. They went to Wadsworth, Nevada, and they're on the Transcontinental Railroad. Once the borax was on the Transcontinental Railroad, then it was distributed all over the world. The Transcontinental Railroad went to San Francisco. They put it on ships. It went around the globe. So while it seems like they were out in the middle of nowhere in the 1870s, they were right in the middle of the world's market. And it was a very reliable situation. These mule teams continued to deliver this product. They were out in Nevada, then they went down to Death Valley. They went out all over the Mojave Desert, several sites out there. And so it's kind of ironic that 150 years ago, they were distributing borax all around the world, and the mules were the key component to get that borax out into the market, and they had a much more reliable supply chain than we have today. So these mules they upheld their end of the deal. They did it. And so the Borax Company, they use these mules as beasts of burden to haul their freight from the early 1870s up until about the turn of that century, up until around 1900. So roughly a quarter of a century, these mules were the supply chain for the world's supply of borax. And it was nearly, the Borax Company nearly had the entire global supply of borax cornered, and it was on these mules were doing it. And then in the around just after the turn of the century, the start of the 1900s, the Borax company decided to start marketing their product with the image of the 20 Mule Team. And that's why we know, in society today, we know the 20 Mule Team. The 20 Mule Team isn't known or recognized because it was anything special at that time. To say that Borax was the only one that did 20 Mule Teams is equivalent of saying that Budweiser is the only organization that hooks up Clydesdales to a wagon. The 20 Mule Teams, like I said, they were everywhere. But then the start of the 1900s, they started marketing it, and their marketing efforts went up into the 1960s, early 1970s. Ron Reagan was a pitchman for them. The 20 Mule Team was all over the United States, just like the Budweiser team was, and they would have a group of salesmen go with it, and they were selling their hand soap and all those products. And that's why we know of the 20 Mule Team, not because there was anything special in the day, but because of their marketing efforts. So those marketing efforts went up into the early 1970s. They started hauling this freight for the actual use of the mule teams in the 1870s. So the Borax company had roughly a 100-year run with these 20 mule teams one way or another. Actually, a quarter of a century, that was the backbone of their moving their freight. And then for another 3/4 of a century is the marketing for selling the products that these mules delivered. Anyway, so how these mule teams work is it's a very, very efficient hitch. It's very different than anything that. It's a kind of a whole different horsemanship type of thing of what was asked of these mules to do then than what we do now. There was nothing showy, nothing fancy about it. It was just very utilitarian type equipment they used. There was nothing that was on the mules, on the hitch, that didn't serve a purpose. And it took a long time for me to figure out what the purpose of a lot of these little parts were that either exist now on harness that's used in a different way than it was then, or parts that don't exist on harness today that was necessary to make this stuff work. But it's a very simple process. And to talk about the simplicity of it, like the Borax company, they were 10 days on the road, 20 mules, and it took 2 guys to do it. So obviously it was a pretty simple situation. To also to understand how all the jerk line, how the mule team works, I think it's worth mentioning kind of why it worked. And the reason it worked is you got to remember the setting they were in. They were not here in town on pavement. They were out in the middle of nowhere, middle of a desert. They just had a 2-track road, and they would hook up in the morning, and the mules had been over the route, and they knew that 15 miles down the road, at the end of that, at that next horizon, there's another water trough. And so there wasn't really a lot of steering that was needed. Quite often I saw pictures they didn't even have the jerk line on. They just hooked the mules up, and they had a little 2-track road across the desert, and they'd tell the mules to go, and they would stomp on down there to the water trough at the end of the day. Then they'd stop for the night. The next day they'd do the same thing. So it wasn't a particularly difficult thing, at least what the Borax guys were doing. You know, some of these other guys like the Kinney team hauling that big generator up Bishop Creek, that was a little more challenging. But the Borax guys, they had really good wagons. They had a nice flat road that you can just see for miles down the road. And so it wasn't a particularly difficult thing. And also the animals, they were beasts of burden, and that's all they did, was they just worked every day. They weren't loaded in a horse trailer and taken to the next site wherever they had to go. They walked. And an adage that I've heard, and I completely agree with it, is that the one thing that wrecked horsemanship more than anything in the history of horsemanship was the invention of horse trailers. And I get that. Up on that mountain over there, there's a thing called the spark plug mine. And I know one guy I know when I was a kid that he said he had to take some mules out there. So he didn't load them in a trailer. They were unbroke mules. He tied them together and dallied up to a saddle horn, and he rode from here to there, handed the mules off to him, and then to go home, he got on his horse and rode to Big Pine. So that that just says something about how horsemanship has changed. The mules, they walked everywhere they went. They worked. It was just an entirely different world. How the animals were treated. They didn't look like this. These mules are just kind of soft little marshmallow mules that aren't very strong. Those mules were really, really muscled up. I was fortunate enough to know a couple of mules when I was a kid that had come from that era, and it was just crazy looking at them compared to these. They didn't at all look like this. They were just a solid chunk of muscle. You'd touch them and it was just as hard as could be, and you think that mule can't move. It was the most fluid, most athletic mule you could imagine. You see the veins in their legs like a professional athlete. It was just such a different thing seeing mules from that era that actually worked 365 days a year than these little softies that we put them in a trailer. I haul them somewhere. They go to work for 2 or 3 months in the mountains, then they turn out to pasture. So it was just a whole different mentality of why these things work so well. They knew their job. They had repetition. That's one thing that mules understand. Since they don't speak English, we can't tell them what we're thinking. If we do the same thing day after day after day after day, they get really good at it. There's pictures of army regiments with a bunch of mules, no halters on, just lined up in front of their saddles. They did that every day. Tell the mules to line up. They line up, put the saddles on, and off you go. So the repetition of what they did also made this stuff work. Some of the biggest challenges that I faced the lack of repetition, and then putting these wagons and mules on pavement and sharp turns. They didn't really do any sharp turns. Like down in Death Valley, there's a picture of them turning around. It's on the wall at the Laws Museum now, the mule team turning around. So one turn they had to make after 160 miles, and it's a huge swing they're making. It's not a little 90-degree turn. So turns, there are pictures of teams, like 12 animal teams and stuff going around switchbacks with smaller loads than the Borax thing, and they have 2 or 3 teams across the chain to get around switchbacks. But for the most part, these teams were just out on a big wide open expanse and just stomping down the road. And the mules, while they had repetition, they knew their job. They weren't gentle, they weren't pets. A mule like this is great for the business we do. It's great for tourism, it's gentle, but it would struggle to work that hard. And so they raised their mules, they were 5 or 6 years old. They would rope them, put them in the team, hook them up, and they would go. And the wilder, the tougher a mule is, the quicker they get to camp at the end of the day. So that's what they wanted. When they would start new mules, they would put them in the hitch, and they just leave them in there at nighttime. As you can see, this hitch is all very comfortable. They can stand there and sleep like that. But you're out in the middle of nowhere, you don't want to take a chance of getting kicked by one of these mules or getting hurt. So they'd put it in, they'd put some hay and water in front of it at night, and after a week or a couple weeks, it would probably get to where you could kind of get around it and get it unhooked. And so first of all, the one question we get is the jerk line. The trick to this thing, the jerk line. How does the jerk line work? What is the jerk line? Why are these teams called jerk line teams? What that refers to is you have that many mules. How are you going to drive them with lines like we do today? So they had a system that they drove the front left mule, which these are the leaders, the front left mule with just a single line. And this is the jerk line, this is the setup. This rope would go back 100 feet to the driver. And so pull the mule slightly, and it brings it left. You jerk it, and the mule's head goes up, and it goes to the right. And that's one of those things that say that horsemanship was different. Today people put tie downs on animals and all that kind of stuff so they don't throw their head. They wanted animals to throw their heads. Today you want animals to bend and be soft and all that kind of stuff. We want this animal just to throw his head and just kind of drift to the right. We don't want it to turn or bend, because his main job is to keep the chain behind it nice and tight. So all he does is he just drifts to the right and drifts to the left, knows how to throw his head, doesn't flex his body at all, just stays nice and stiff as a board going down the road. And that's really all the jerk line was for. You come to a Y in the road, you go to the left Y or the right Y. It wasn't for doing barrel racing or anything like that, obviously. And so how the jerk line worked. So while it seems like there's only one rein, there's actually two. So this is what we have in the mule's mouth right here. So obviously, pull here on this, pulls the mule's head to the left. What I do is I jerk it, and they use a leverage bit on this. This is called a leverage bit. It's got the shank down there. On the back of the shank, there's this chain. So all I'm trying to do is hit this chain on those bones on the mule's, on the bottom of the mule's head right here. You hit those bones, look what his head does. It goes up. So I just pop that to get that chain to hit his head, and the head goes up. This strap here, the right side rein, is hooked to the collar. His head goes up. The slack comes out of that, pulls his head to the right. So there really are two reins. One of them's 100 feet long, and one of them's just long enough to get to the mule's collar. So if I pop her hard enough, her head will go up, the slack will come out of that, and she goes that way. See how she just goes over that way, just standing here. So she wants to just pulled over that way. So that's the trick to a jerk line. It took me a long time to figure it out. It wasn't about the bit. The bit doesn't really have anything to do with anything. It's this chain, the jaw chain, the chin strap, whatever you want to call it. We all use chin straps on bridles. That's what it's about. It's about that chin strap. And so it's a ingenious, simple process. And this mule's done this enough now. I don't need this strap on there. I don't need the leverage bit anymore. Just touch it. See, she's trying to go. Just barely touch it now. She's going that way. So it's great when I'm real close to the mule. But the problem is if I have a 20 mule team, I'm 100 feet away from the mule. And a mule in the middle of the line, it walks out to the side. And the mule steers her to the left. It pulls it to the side. So that's one thing I deal with. And so I always, in parades, if I always have a person near my leaders just to be safe. Because if the mule does want to come back around to the left, there's really not much I can do. I can keep popping her, but I have no way to physically pull her back to the right. So I keep somebody there just to be safe in these, because you never know when some little kid in a stroller is going to come running out from that side at it or something like that. So that's how the jerk line works. It's just that simple. I steer this mule left and right, and then from this mule there's called a jockey stick. That farmers and stuff still use jockey sticks on plowing with mules. That is hooked to this mule's collar. So whichever way this mule goes, I have it hooked to that one's halter. Whichever way this one goes, that one has to go. And then for the offside leader, just have a buck strap that hooks from his bit back to this mule's tugs down there to a single tree, so that mule can't get ahead of this one. Because I have had, if that mule stops and this jockey stick gets it, something that's not a 90-degree angle off this guy's chest, this one doesn't have a lot of control, so I got to keep it. And then the tugs down there to the single tree, I have this mule set, so it's about that far ahead. This mule walks about that far ahead of the other mule to keep that jockey stick going straight across to the other mules. So these two mules are going down the road with one slightly ahead of the other, just for the efficiency of that. And then, so that's the steering. That's the steering of the lead team. So we got the lead team going down the road we want it. Now the next issue is getting the wagons to go down the road. There's myths out there. It's been written stuff that the wheelers are back there, that they steer the wagons. It's actually the mules. A pair of mules called the pointers that are right in front of the wheelers. They're hooked to the end of the tongue. That tongue's 12 or 13 feet long. The mules are hooked to that, so they have a lot of leverage for steering the wagons. The wheelers really don't do much of anything. So we have a good pair of leaders that lead us down the road, and then a good pair of pointers hooked to the front of the tongue, and they steer the wagons independently of the rest of the team. If the rest of the team is going left, they may have to go right to pull the wagons around the turn. When we get into really, really tight areas, like these 90-degree turns, we'll put several teams across the chain, across that long chain that goes down the middle, to kind of bend the chain around the turn rather than allowing it to to cheat to the inside of the turn. So it's the hitch is all about the leaders and the pointers. Much information is made up about the wheelers, and that why the Borax they often took 2 horses on the team, and it's written that because the horses were bigger and stronger and they could steer the wagons. Well, if they were bigger and stronger and could do all that, why didn't they have 20 of them? No, they took the horses along. There's one thing about mules is the bell mare. We all hear the story about the bell mare. We use these mules in the mountains for pack trips. At nighttime, we turn loose in the mountains. We put a bell on the mare. We listen for the bell. We find the mare. All the mules are with her. You're out in the middle of the Mojave Desert and you don't have a horse, and the mule gets loose or whatever you're doing with them at nighttime. They know that the mare is back at camp, back in Mojave or down Death Valley. You may get up in the morning and not have any mules. So the reason for the horses, that they took the horses to keep the mules together. And the wheel spot is a place to hide the weaker animals. This long chain that goes along here, that's just a chain gang, and those mules, they all have to push. They have to push hard on their collars all day. And the horses they couldn't handle that. So they take some horses for bell mares to keep the mules happy. They put them in as wheelers to kind of make it easier for them so they could keep up with the mules. And so that's the story with the wheelers and the 20 Mule Team. And so most old pictures I've seen of hitches that were out for numerous days at a time, there would be 1 or 2 horses mixed in there. Other hitches that were just working locally, that they'd be home every night, I would see they had all mules in there. But it took me a while to figure that out. It was just the old bell mare thing, and that's something we've done forever. In the packing business, and then the cavalry traveled across the country. They loose-herded their mules. They had their mules loose. They had a bell mare, and off they went. So that's what that was about. That the wheel spot is a place to hide the weaker animals. In this type of hitch, the wheelers do a little bit of steering on the tongue, maybe, but it's really insignificant compared to the pointers in front. So your best mules are the leaders and the pointers. And another efficiency in these types of hitches is that, so this, you see the spreaders, the single trees all on the ground here. So it's very light when we're standing around. There's no weight on the mule. They're very comfortable here. But once it starts moving, these spreaders, it all kind of floats along at about this height here, which for an animal to pull efficiently, you want the line of draft, is what this is called, the power, to be at a 90-degree angle to the shoulder. So the shoulder is sloped here a little bit, so at a 90-degree angle, comes down right to that spot. So the mules are very, very efficient because of that. Obviously, if this angle is coming this way, all the pressure hits just in the point of the shoulder. If the line of draft is too steep, then all the pressure gets pulled here and the collar is rocked out like that. So it's a very efficient situation when it puts that collar right flat on the animal's shoulder, and it's that way all the way down the hitch. And then the unique thing about the Borax wagons, that there's other wagons similar to the Borax wagons around the western United States. But one thing where the Borax company was operating was they had sand. They were the Mojave Desert, the sand of Death Valley. So they put those big wide tires on their wagons. So that's kind of the thing visually that sets their wagons apart from other wagons, is that they have those great big wide tires that it just kind of catches your eye. There's another set of wagons up in Idaho that I pull every year, and they're very close to the Borax wagons, but they look completely different. It's just because they have 3 or 4 inch wide tires instead of the big wide 8-inch tires. And up there they had a lot of mud. And the Bell teams in the East Coast, that they had mud. So you put the narrow wheels on to cut through the mud, put the big wide wheels on to float across the sand. And so that's what you see on the Borax wagons, is the big wide wheels, and that's just visually, it makes them look different. So the big wide wheels, like the guys down at the beach with their big sand buggies, they have those great big old wide wheels on them. And the reason that the guy would ride the wheeler is from that spot, you can run a rope to the brake lever, so you can work that. But more importantly, right in front of you are the pointers. And so you can steer the pointers from that spot. Guys would use a whip. I've read guys taking a fishing pole and put a weight on it, and just to chase those pointers back and forth across the chain to steer the wagons. So that was the reason that they would be on a wheeler, was one because they didn't want to walk, so they could work the brake and they could work the pointers from that spot. So, and then when they rode them, they had Teamster saddles. It was kind of like an English type saddle, no saddle horn, just a very light saddle, so the animal didn't have to carry anything extra. And I found when you're working the pointers, you know, the jerk line and stuff, the saddle horn just gets in your way. So those old Teamster saddles were a pretty unique thing with big fenders on them to protect your leg from because you had this, your leg was hanging over the tug chain here. So they did whatever it took. But and I looked, like I said, I looked through the pictures and I see there's subtle little differences. Some of them, they would have a way kind of to suspend this stuff to keep it from being on the ground all the time. So, but it was all accomplished the same thing. It was a very, very efficient hitch for hauling lots of freight, all kinds of freight all over the United States. The bells. So back east, these teams were called bell teams. And and back there it was very mountain, or rolling hills, muddy terrain. It was a rough go back there. Teams were getting stuck in the mud quite often, and they had lots of bells on them. And the story was that if you get stuck and another teamster comes along and it has to pull you out of the ditch, you give them your bells. That's where we've all heard the saying, "I'll be there with bells on." That's where that came from. Just give a little slack there. That's where that came from. It meant if you arrived at your destination with all your bells on your mules, you had a good trip. You didn't get stuck. So that's where that saying came from. "I'll be there with bells on." You had a good journey. But they also say that the bells were to warn of oncoming teams. Go back there where it's rolling hills, you have a smaller team, that kind of stuff, that might have worked. But out here in the Mojave Desert, if you've seen the Mojave Desert, you're going to see a team coming for 3 days before you encounter it. So that doesn't really work for this application. But what it really does, and it's very important, and it's so obvious when you're working the mules how important it is, the bells give the mules a cadence to pull to. It's just crazy when I'm out working the mules and I don't have the bells on, how slow they get going, and I'm always trying to keep them moving, but you put the bells on, and it's kind of this subconscious cadence that they all walk to, and I've read that in numerous accounts. They say the team walks a half a mile to a mile an hour faster with the bells on, and it really works. And I've seen a few videos of our teams. We're going down the road, and you can see the mules all kind of hitting their collars a little bit. Not really hitting them, but just kind of walking in rhythm, and the bells hitting at the same time. And it truly is amazing how the difference that makes, having those bells on. And so when I'm practicing, when I'm working anymore, I don't even bother to go out without the bells. It's amazing how that works. And I'm sitting on the wagon without the bells, and it's boring and it's quiet. Just that background noise is so it really works. And one time I did have to surrender my bells. I did get stuck one time, and of course it was in the East Coast. We were back there in 2017 for the 4th of July parade, and we went to make a turn and put the pointers out a little too soon and put the wagons into a wet, muddy East Coast ditch, and they were stuck down in there, and one of our guys was along with his Jeep, and so I just had him pull the wagons up a little bit and just give me a little push to get started. So he had to pull me out of the ditch, so even though he was in a Jeep, I had to give him a set of my bells. So yeah, so I waited till after the parade was over the next day, and at the end of the parade the next day, I said, "Okay, you pulled me out of the ditch yesterday, here's your bells." So that was a deal, so I didn't get home with bells on that day. Anybody have any questions?
Do you have the Death Valley Company initials? Are those original or replica?
What this is, DVC, and that stands for what is now the Death Valley Conservancy. And what the Death Valley Conservancy is, it's an organization largely made up of retired borax employees that have an appreciation for the history of Death Valley, the history of borax, the history of the 20 Mule Team. And so the Death Valley Conservancy is a nonprofit organization that now owns the wagons. The borax company, like I said, they're not doing much promotion themselves with the wagons. They have a set of wagons that are pretty close to being unusable now, and So that with one thing the Death Valley Conservancy did was they raised money, built the wagons, and they're kind of the 20 Mule Team now, the Death Valley Conservancy, in addition to they raise money for lots of projects in Death Valley. Like there's a conservancy that helps out Yosemite National Park. There's those different things. So that's the Death Valley Conservancy is. Mr. Preston Chiaro here is a former Borax official, and he's now part of the Death Valley Conservancy. So that's what that is. So the Mule Team is really, if it's sponsored by anybody now, it's sponsored by the Death Valley Conservancy, not the Borax Company. The Borax Company does support us. They still support the 20 Mule Team, and they still help us with projects, but they're not in the business of marketing their product, because the Borax Company does not sell the hand soap anymore. That hand soap, or the laundry soap that we can still buy on the shelves, that's sold by Dial Soap. As much as I'd like to think I'm a great trainer and really make these mules do great things, what it really comes down to is the personality of the mule. Maybe I'm not a very good trainer, but at least I can recognize the traits that they're good at. And that's kind of what it is. That some mules, they're just willing to get out in front and go. Some mules, you can't get them out in front for anything. And so, so this is a mule that when I first bought it, this mule would just go. We were using it for saddle mule and stuff. There was no problem. It had to wait for the mare. It didn't have to wait for the horse. You could just get on it and go. That's a mule that would make a good leader. The mules, the main ones used right in front of the tongue for jumping over the chain. I bought one of those two mules. I was at a parade in Boron, California for the 20 Mule Team. A trader showed up. He gave me the mule. I put it in the hitch. We're going down the road. First day, the mule's just jumping back and forth across the chain on its own. So I could talk for hours about how you train a mule to jump the chain, but the reality of it is I don't know how much I have to do with it, how much of it is the mules are smarter than I am. And I mean, the mule is crazy. That mule, I can't keep it in the corral at home. It just jumps the fence. And so we're going down the road, and I won't even really see it, but the chain will just kind of crowd a little bit towards it and just steps to the other side. And it keeps, and I've been on some dirt roads where the first day we go along and the wagons are kind of bouncing through the sagebrush and little turns and stuff. The second day through it, that wagon is right in the tracks the whole time. And those two pointers are that good. It's just, so yeah, I'll take credit for being a great trainer, but I think it's a case I just learned more from the mules than they learn from me. And so I've got two pairs of mules that are they're the leaders, and I've got the real good pair of mules that they're the pointers. And then I've got some other mules that I'm kind of bringing along, trying to teach them to cross the chain. Some of them take to it pretty quickly, and some of them it's just not their thing. So I think that it's kind of, for me anyway, it's more the ability just to recognize what a mule is and go with it. So the question is, how do I start? How do I teach, take an unbroke mule, and how do I do it? I do whatever it takes to get hooked up in the hitch, and off we go. 19 other mules are going that way, it's got to go that way with it. And I just let it figure it out. I kind of tie it in so it doesn't give it a lot of latitude to go different directions. But it's amazing how quick they take to it. This thing is just, and like I said, that's what they did then. They didn't break them. They just put them in the hitch. And just kind of the only thing about training a young animal is that they have to get their shoulders conditioned. Conditioned to pushing on a collar. Kind of like your hands. If you use a shovel long enough, your hands can get calloused, get toughened up, it doesn't hurt you. So that's the same thing that has to happen here. So that's the only thing I worry about. I take a young animal and work it for a couple days. You can see that their shoulders start to get a little sore. And then I'll lay it off for a couple days or a week or so, just to get it shoulder. Then I put it back in. And once that's done then as long as the collar fits good, their shoulders stay good and healthy. They don't get skinned up. And that's really all the training it takes. Just put them in and let them figure it out. I don't do any type of groundwork whatsoever. And some of the old teamsters, they talked about how wild their mules were. They'd have a hook. They would reach down rather than reach down there to get the chain hooked to the single tree, because the mules would kick at them and were so difficult to work with. So, and that's what they did. They just put them in there and off you go, figure it out. The roads back then also, there were no automobiles compacting the road. Washboards hadn't been invented, the whole thing. Every once in a while they'd drag something behind the wagons. And the people from that era that I've talked to, that their grandparents, their parents worked teams, they said that before automobiles, these roads stayed super smooth, really smooth. And so obviously you've got 20 animals, and they had big cleats on their shoes, so the shoes wouldn't wear out. It wasn't necessarily for traction, so their shoes wouldn't wear out. So you've got 20 animals in front churning the dirt up, and then you have no automobiles compacting it, and once in a while drag along it. And they said the road surfaces stayed very nice, and it was like this all the time. The wagons were rolling over, and that's when I look at old pictures. That's one of the first things I look at. I look at what the road surface looks like, and there's some pictures of the 20 Mule Team working, and it's dirt like this. And you go out there now, and it's like concrete. It's just so compacted and washboardy, and so that's a big part of it. So these animals were walking on soft ground. They were just going at a walk all day long. And so that's another thing that really made it work. Like I said earlier, one of the biggest obstacles I face is being on pavement. I don't have that resistance from the nice smooth dirt for both the mules and the wagons. And so I would assume with that many animals, sometimes there was probably something, an animal would come up lame, or there was injuries, and you got to keep going. Then you don't have much choice. Who knows? Back then maybe they barbecued the animal if it was really that bad. It was a different world. You got to understand. So yeah, it's a different world, different mentality, a different thing than what we deal with today, and that's just the reality of it. But they, the mules, they worked, the Borax, when they hauled out of Death Valley, they ran for 5 years out of Death Valley in the winter times, then they moved to higher elevation in the summers, and they talked about never losing an animal, never having a wagon wreck, never having any problems in 5 years, continuous operation doing that. So it was a pretty reliable, safe deal. The question is, how did we go to Washington, D.C.? What did it take to get this whole thing moved to Washington, D.C.? We rented a flatbed semi-trailer. We put the 3 big wagons on that. And I have 2 very big gooseneck trailers that each can haul about a dozen mules. We took 20 head, or 21 head. And so we had two big gooseneck trailers and an 18-wheeler with some 3 big wagons on it, and had a big road trip. And then we had some of the crew drove, some of them flew back there, and we went and did a couple appearances, did our parade, and loaded everything and drove home. That was one thing that was amazing about that trip that really got me, was that it didn't matter where we were. The wagons were on a flatbed trailer, so you could see them. Every time we stopped at a restaurant or a truck stop, somebody would pull up and say, "The Borax wagons." It wasn't they would come up and say, "What are those? What's this?" They knew it, and it was mostly people my age and older, but they knew what the Borax wagons were all over the country. That kind of caught me off guard about that whole marketing campaign they had, that how recognized the Borax wagons were. There were sometimes we went to a truck stop and we couldn't get out of there. People would keep pulling up to look at the wagons and want to know about the wagons, and they'd all have stories about their granddad listening to the old Ranger on the radio and the 20 Mule Team stories. And that